Good morning, everybody. My presentation today is the science of wheelchair sports. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's unfortunate that I can't be in Finland today, but obviously I'm very appreciative of still being here via virtual presentation, and I look forward to joining you live after the presentation as part of a Q&A that follows this particular presentation. So I'm Vicky Toffrey, and I'm the director of the Peterhouse Centre for Disability Sport. And the topic and theme for today really is around the research agenda, the applied sports science that I've undertaken over many years. And I'm going to be sharing data around support, provision, the philosophy of what I do from my perspective, and as well there's going to be several contributions that have taken place from my PhD and postdoctoral staff here at Loughborough University. I'd like to acknowledge the work and efforts of them as well. So the science of wheelchair sports. If I first start by saying what is my environment, then my environment is pretty much this one that's shown on this slide just here. It's really trying to understand more around the athlete, their performance, the interaction of them with the wheelchair, the interface. And obviously, whilst this is a picture of them in the laboratory, I'm looking to try and understand the picture to try and improve their performance, whether that be through physiological assessment, through the biomechanics, again, through the integration of both and adopting an ergonomic perspective, but ultimately to try and enhance their performance. And that's the performance on the court. This is a wheelchair rugby player. So it's very important that we understand the sporting context of which we're gathering the data from in the first step. But this is one of the environments that you indeed would find me in. So just moving on to the environment, then over the many years, there's been a shift around the sports scientists here in the UK, where we are sharing and integrating provision in terms of sports science services, the medical provision, and indeed the sports scientists are working across both an Olympic, Paralympic environment. And that obviously has its pros and cons in terms of knowledge base, the translation of knowledge from the Olympic athlete to the Paralympic athlete, but indeed sharing best practice. There is some specialist knowledge that is important that I'm going to sort of just again share you in terms of my philosophy of things. But what is important is the fact that in the UK, that we are sharing best practice. We are working across the exercise continuum, and indeed we're working in and between these two environments. Now, if I do focus your attention on the Paralympic athlete, then there are 10 eligible impairment types. This following the IPC classification committee guidance that sort of recently been renewed over the last 12 months is really sort of the backdrop to Paralympic sport in terms of what the impairment type is, what are the disabilities of the individuals that we're working with. And indeed, some of the athletes that I've worked with from para-triathlon have had a visual impairment, and in wheelchair rugby and wheelchair basketball, wheelchair tennis. Then I've also worked with persons who have cerebral palsy, an amputation and a spinal cord injury. But today's presentation, whilst it is focusing on the wheelchair athlete, primarily the research that we do in the laboratory does tend to focus itself a little bit more on persons with a spinal cord injury. And that would be the main driver of today's presentation, but in the Q&A maybe we might be able to answer some further questions and insights other sort of impairments that I have worked with. So my philosophy really stems from this picture here, working in terms of trying to address questions to get the answers, and obviously a training solution or innovation as such in terms of a training innovation. But I use very much an athlete-centered approach, and indeed something that's co-produced in discussion with the sports practitioners, the coaches, the athletes themselves. And obviously I try and then underpin some scientific research in that sporting arena, try and look at in operation, try and think about innovation, and indeed it's the translation of the knowledge of trying to collect data, but obviously meaningful data, so it actually has an impact and the coach can actually utilize it as a recommendation to an intervention or to complement their training practice that they're doing. So this is just one sort of illustration from hand cycling, where obviously we do study the sport. We then try and gather and profile the sport in the laboratory, and obviously we then try and put that into practice through manipulations of cadence as one example, and then try and do some recommendations on a case-by-case basis to the athletes that we're working with. So the environment that I find myself in is all around good partnerships. If we're looking to undertake sports science support, or indeed a word that we might say around applied research, then really the primary aim of the sports science support programme is to provide high performance athletes with information about their training, as well as obviously making recommendations for interventions that may be used to enhance their performance. But what we're trying to do is that we need to be doing this in partnership. We need to dovetail the needs of the coach and the support staff, so that if there's a scientist in the backdrop, that they're not seen as just there to gather data, to publish and to pop it onto a shelf, and the data is not used. It is a partnership where we get the buy-in by the athletes, and this sort of picture here shows it quite nicely actually, where Barry Mason, one of my postdoc researchers, is talking around GPS monitoring, and there's a group of wheelchair rugby players where we're explaining what we're looking to do, and then obviously we then go and collect some data to then share that data to put it into practice to ultimately enhance their rugby performance. So it's about buy-in and having very good relationships with indeed the national sporting governing bodies, and the sports that I have worked with have been wheelchair racing, wheelchair basketball, wheelchair tennis, wheelchair rugby and para-triathlon. But the approach is as being a bit more of a managerial role now, as really the scientist on the ground, i.e. my first Paralympic Games was in '96, was working with wheelchair racing. I'm not really there with the athletes now. I'm obviously strategically planning things, but it's usually my younger staff members who find themselves in the arena with the athletes. And here we actually have got Tom Paulson, where in the Rio cycle, we were very much adopted what we described as an embedded scientist approach, where we had Tom, who was there within the sporting structure, but was the exercise physiologist undertaking profiling, interventions, and really trying to ensure that the athletes were fit, their well-being was good in terms of fit and healthy lifestyles, and he would integrate the knowledge into the actual performance system with the coaches and the practitioners. Now, the other aspect that we must be considering is that we need to think about what is wheelchair performance. And to understand wheelchair performance, we need to be thinking of the characteristics that we can measure, and indeed the factors that contribute to performance. So whilst we might break down the performance of tennis and say, well, wheelchair tennis involves serve, stroke efficiency, movement and all those parameters, we need to actually be saying what constitutes wheelchair tennis gameplay in the first place, i.e. we have the athletes, and indeed the height, the body mass and their impairment type and skill level are key to their potential, but obviously we can train potential, to the interaction of them with the configuration of the wheelchair and what suits them best, to ultimately lead to efficiency, high power output, physiological demands being balanced, a good proportion technique, their force effectiveness, and indeed their perceptions of effort and all the characteristics of performance. And obviously what we can see here is we begin then to see a very complex model of performance. And this is before we even get into, like I mentioned, breaking down the characteristics of performance. But one of the key aspects that we have been looking at is more so wheelchair mobility and ensuring that the fitness, the chair, the interaction of the two is designed and the data that we gather is in a suitable way that we can actually understand more around efficiency has been one of our drivers in some of our research. But I'll come to this model later on, but hopefully you can just begin to see that we do need to have a very wide appreciation of the individual, and that is underpinned by the impairment and obviously their capabilities, but not putting them in boxes until we understand the potential and trainability of the athletes that we're working with. So hopefully the introduction has just really just explained a little bit around where I come from and the philosophy of how I work with athletes and teams. But in terms of the brief for today's presentation, then there's sort of two parts to what I'm doing. The first one is just going to be really just giving a little bit of basics and background to the fundamentals of testing wheelchair athletes, what kind of physiological differences there are between your non-spinal and those who are more eligible, I guess, for wheelchair basketball, being paraplegic, and those with tetraplegia who play wheelchair rugby. But then I want to put into perspective three aspects around putting research into practice, talking around smart training and how we monitor training, how we optimise the wheelchair configuration for wheelchair games play, and indeed how we might be able to identify cooling strategies to prevent overheating, and particularly for those athletes who might be competing in a hot, humid climate, or indeed who are exposed to that climate but still play indoors. And generally throughout the whole presentation, I hope just to share with you my professional experience around just working with individuals with physical impairments and what sort of are maybe the different considerations and the kind of disabilities that you then need to consider different things for. So just moving on then, I like this picture here because this really has been the driver of what's inspired me to work within parasports. It's actually Karen Dark, an athlete and good friend actually, who's been coming into the laboratory for many, many years and has been undertaking sports such as wheelchair racing, hand cycling and para-triathlon. And here we have an image where she's on the start line with runners behind her, runners who are just about to start maybe their Garmin watches, polar heart rate watches, to maybe guide and prescribe their intensity of what speed they're going to be going at. And we ask ourselves, what does Karen do in this situation? And indeed, if we want to test her, then do the physiological testing methods of wheelchair sportsperson differ to those used to test an Olympic athlete? Of course, we've got the clear aspect around the differences of the modality. So we have upper body exercise versus whole body activities in terms of running versus pushing a wheelchair. But indeed, we need to be thinking more about the interpretation of the data. What's our expected normative values that we're looking at, and how we use that information, again, like I say, to put together an effective training schedule and indeed optimize performance on the day. So the first aspect really is that we must understand the physical impairment. We must be thinking, well, what does the individual look like? And here is a sort of a DEXA image, looking at low percentage body fat, looking at an MRI in terms of the musculature of an able-bodied person and the bone structure. And we compare that to a wheelchair individual, someone who's incomplete spinal cord, 6 weeks post injury. We can see very much different aspect in terms of curvature of the spine on the DEXA image on the left, on the lower image, down to the fact that they've got very low bone mineral density, and indeed they've got a lot more fat and less muscle mass in terms of the lower limbs as a consequence of the spinal cord injury. In addition to that, there's a whole host of different aspects that have happened physiologically because of bed rest, of which, you know, a couple of the key aspects there is the decrease in the muscle volume, but indeed there's differences in the blood volume and how that's distributed, and indeed the slight change that I've read about, but I'm no expert, around the difference of the muscle fibre types during the consequences of bed rest and the rehabilitation aspect. Increases in percentage body fat, and like I mentioned, if they were to fall out of the wheelchair, then there might be some issues in terms of fracture risk, etc. So physiologically, there's a huge difference between persons who are able-bodied, i.e. the Olympic athletes, versus those who have paraplegia, tetraplegia and require a wheelchair. And so with that in mind, we need to be thinking again of the different physiological consequences between an Olympic and Paralympic individual, i.e., for example, I know from some of Claudio Perriot's work from the Swiss Paraplegic Research Centre that the gastric emptying rate is very different in someone who is spinal cord injured versus an able-bodied person. So their digestion rate may well be 21 hours versus, 3 or 4 hours. So you need to think that in terms of timing of nutrition supplementations. We need to be thinking about the wheelchair design, thinking about cooling aspects and cardiac output because of the venous blood pooling in the lower extremities that aren't being used. So we may go to a source such as PubMed, have a little Google and see what Google Scholar provides us in terms of the evidence. And even just today, i.e. maybe a week before this presentation is shared with you, is that I had a look at the word Olympic sport versus Paralympic sport. And that's sort of quite a wide, far-reaching term. But there's a quarter of the data out there in terms of the Paralympic evidence, i.e. we're comparing over 4,000 papers to over 1,000 papers. So there's not as much evidence out there. There's not as much focus on Paralympic sport. So again, that's one of the main remits of the Peter Harrison Centre here in Loughborough, is that we want to be sort of working, engaging in this arena to be undertaking quality research, but something that's meaningful to sporting performance and translation to coaches and practitioners. So if I start with laboratory testing, then we're quite fortunate that our laboratory is very well equipped, and we have got a motorised treadmill, a wheelchair ergometer, a loader for upper body arm exercise. And obviously we're going to utilise these pieces of equipment for different population groups or different trained status. So obviously if we're looking for talent, I'll come to this bit in a moment, we might actually be quite happy to undertake exercise, because there we're not actually looking at the combination of the athlete in a poor fitted chair, because they might not actually have been fitted for a bespoke wheelchair at that moment in time. We want to look at their performance potential, whereas if we're working with an elite athlete who has been in a wheelchair for several years and they've been fitted into a wheelchair, then indeed we want to look at that configuration and the interaction of them plus the wheelchair to be understanding the physiology and their responses to exercise. So again, depending on what we want to achieve will mean we do a different type of test in the laboratory or in the field. And just moving on to just some fundamental reading, if you're not that familiar with upper body exercise, I do draw your attention to quite an elegant paper by Glazier back in the 1980s in Journal of Applied Physiology, where they were comparing the physiological responses to maximal effort wheelchair ergometry and arm crank ergometry. And it's quite a nice paper just for you to familiarise yourself with sort of normative values at the lower end of the spectrum of sort of maybe not really your highly trained individuals, but just try and account for what differences you might have due to the modality. So, for example, if we look at the peak oxygen uptake and we have a look at arm crank on the sort of left illustration just here, but we have the arm crank peak VO2 versus the wheelchair ergometer VO2, we see quite close agreement between arm crank ergometry and wheelchair propulsion for determining the VO2 peak value. But if we have a look at the lactate and the maximal blood lactate concentrations during arm crank ergometry, we see we have higher values in the arm cranking versus the wheelchair propulsion. And that's where we just then need to be bringing to image and picture the two different modalities and what may differ between both, i.e. If I just move a little bit further to looking at power output, we see a greater power output being achieved on the arm crank, a greater heart rate being produced on the arm crank compared to what is achieved on the wheelchair ergometer. So again, just picture the two different modalities. And I draw your attention to the fact that if you're cranking and using an arm crank ergometer, then again, there may well be a difference in terms of the fact that you're asynchronously using the ergometer, but at the same time, we are also comparing the two against something that is then using synchronous activity, because when you use your wheelchair, you're pushing simultaneously. So the difference in terms of maybe how an arm crank ergometer is set up, you can pull and push and generate more power. You can have a laboratory set up with some weights behind the wheelchair, or you can transfer into a stable chair, which then means that you can really generate some good power against the arm crank. But what it does allow us to do is isolate the level of injury and we can then try and understand the physical capacities, functional capacity of an individual in relation to their trunk stability. So it really does allow us to have a look at a really good profile in terms of power output potential, VO2 peak, heart rate capacity during that particular modality. However, if we really want to translate this to wheelchair propulsion, then I would recommend obviously that because wheelchair sports do involve cyclic motion, and obviously an athlete is very free in their technique to choose where they make contact with the push rim, their recovery, the force application, whether or not they push simultaneously, etc., depending on whether they're cruising back on a basketball court or want to go in a straight line, is that we do need to try and make, where possible, the testing ecologically valid. But again, showing back the glacier work, we need to be very mindful that if we're then looking at power output on a wheelchair ergometer, it's going to be very much lower than what we might find on an arm crank ergometry. So we can't compare too much literature of different modalities. So if we start with one modality and we're doing a longitudinal training study, we must do post-assessment using that same modality. So it's very important that we consider that. And also what we must consider, and it's very prevalent in the literature from the Dutch group, is trying to maybe improve mechanical efficiency. And what you will see here is I'm highlighting that pushing an everyday wheelchair, then the mechanical efficiency is only about 5 or 6% efficient, and possibly only 8% when you're actually maybe in a sports wheelchair. Compare that to arm crank ergometry and recreational hand cycling, where you're operating at 15%. Very, very big differences. There's lots of physical strain pushing a wheelchair. You're potentially at greater risk of injuries. But yes, you can obviously push outdoors and your arm crank is limited to indoors. But if you're prescribing rehabilitation individuals exercise, and I would actually highly recommend using a hand bike, because that will potentially prevent the stresses and strains on the shoulders, on the wrist, and you can then hopefully get that physiological benefit and central adaptations more so maybe than using your wheelchair in the early stages, although obviously you do need to master your skill, etc. So there is debate around obviously the efficiency and transferability to other sports, but we do need to bear that in mind depending on the skill level and stage of the individual that you're working with. So to summarise, I guess for arm crank, you've got that force production over the whole motion cycle, but for wheelchair propulsion, you have got the rest periods. It's discontinuous, but cyclic in nature, and obviously it's going to be very different in terms of those two different modalities. If I move on to treadmill testing, then obviously you are restricting an individual to straight line pushing only, but it has been shown to be very effective to monitor sort of early season, moving across to in season before competition training, where you get that rightward shift in a blood lactate concentration. We can use it to look at blood lactate analysis for thresholds, VO2 peak improvements, looking at peak speed, different lactate thresholds, and we certainly do use it for prescription of training. So using a treadmill, if you do have access to them, obviously is very good. And like I've mentioned, we have seen adaptation to training then using treadmill testing protocols. In the Netherlands, they have a pulley rig, which allows you to perhaps control a little bit more of power output. And this is just an illustration of the setup where we've got our treadmill attachment with a wheelchair. We've got a pulley system on the back to put some additional weights on, where indeed via a calculation, we could actually try and look at mechanical efficiency in terms of the energy out, energy in relation to trying to control the power output. A lot of work has been done in the early days of looking at power output. I must admit, a lot of my data is pretty much the wheelchair interface, the athlete, the mass of them on the treadmill, and I do more speed-based protocols. But again, I can direct you to some reading around that if anyone does email me after the presentation. What I do recommend for assessments, physiological assessments, is that you have a look at the BASES expert statement. This can be downloaded on a website, and I believe it is freely available, which is an expert statement around testing individuals and looking at exercise performance in athletes with a spinal cord injury, and the details are on the bottom of this slide here, again, that I can share with the audience. If you home in onto the tables, what we can see there is different protocols and recommendations of the wattage that you might do depending on whether you're working with someone who's got tetraplegia and high para, and what sort of normative values you might actually expect in those different sort of categories. And again, if you're working with someone who has high level tetraplegia, you might actually be thinking about assisted devices, strapping, if you're doing an arm crank protocol, so they can actually hold the hand grips and actually then use the arm crank. So there are some sort of technical devices that could help with your testing in the laboratory or in a field-based environment. There has been a paper by Hartung back in '93. There's not really anything I know that's been done since that looked at actually 3 different wheelchair treadmill protocols: increasing grade, increasing speed, and a speed and grade increase combination. There wasn't really too much differences between peak VO2 and the tests, although for the reliability they did suggest more combined protocol of the speed and grade increase. I must admit, I don't necessarily have a standardized protocol. It's all done by my experience of someone coming to the laboratory, and I sort of know their capabilities. But I am just about to reproduce a handbook for BASES, the British Association of Sport and Exercise Sciences, on some protocol guidance over the next year. What I would recommend, though, is that obviously if you do just go for a speed-only protocol, then a limiting factor is the arm speed, because that then will drive elevations in the blood lactate concentration, and that then means that fatigue sets in early. And obviously you do need to be aware of the trunk function if obviously you have a gradient protocol, because sometimes that then means it gives restrictions for people to keep up with the belt if the treadmill is increasing in large increments. So again, you've got to be mindful of the populations of who you're working with to see what is more appropriate. And again, what we must bear in mind is this whole study, though, was actually working at a very, very low speed, only 1.33 meters per second, which isn't something that your wheelchair racers or hand cyclists will be working at. It's more your recreational, just daily pushing, because it's a paper back in the early 90s. But again, it gives you a flavour for the type of protocol that you might actually adopt. I'll just skip on quickly from that one there, but what I will just do is highlight the take-home message that if you're comparing VO2 peak between athletes, I would recommend for you to have a look at a research article that I did quite a few years ago now in MedSci. I work with athletes in the same sport that could range between 55 to 120 kilos, and if you're dividing that through scaling that just basically on body mass, then you don't really have a fair representation of capabilities. So I do recommend that you do also do a scaled VO2 to 0.82 in some of the data that I found to look at comparable values across athletes of the different body sizes. I would guide you to the paper of Christoph Light that's again got some normative data of athletes, so they're all similar train status, but just different classifications. So here we've got individuals who have tetraplegia, rugby athletes, their VO2 peak is around about 1.67, and you'll see the linearity of increase to basketball paraplegics, 2.4 litres per minute, going through to your amputee athletes in wheelchair, basketball and tennis who have VO2s in excess of 3 litres. You'll see the heart rate is increasing, and indeed the blood lactate is increasing as well. And I'll come on to that in a moment. If we look at wheelchair ergometer testing, then yes, on an ergometer you are restricted to straight line pushing, but we have actually found that doing a 30 seconds, even a little bit more, 45 second sprints on a wheelchair ergometer, because you have to overcome the inertia of the rollers and resistance, is that we do utilise it quite well to look at the peak speed, look at the minimum speed, and again, work out a percentage drop off in terms of fatigue index that you typically would see in the 30-second sprint anaerobic protocols for able-bodied athletes, and you could utilise something fairly similar as well. Hopefully the video works, but actually it doesn't, so I'll sort of skip this one here. But what I was going to just share with you is just our new wheelchair ergometer that actually shows the differences between right and left asymmetries. So what we actually have here is basically an athlete doing a sprint on a wheelchair ergometer, and because we've got a dual roller system, it does allow us to look at the asymmetries between athletes, and then what we can do from that is we can begin to tailor a strength and conditioning program to try and balance those asymmetries, or actually see if it's linked to the impairment type. So someone with a coordination impairment, someone with cerebral palsy, might actually fatigue and then show these imbalances. And obviously we want to then try and work a strategy through training to improve those imbalances. And so we've done some longitudinal work with athletes to try and work on these asymmetries. Again, we try and instruct a little bit around technical features, different types of double looping versus single circular sort of type of activities. And so we dovetail a lot of our work with some technical feedback as well through video analysis. Some research might use what they call functional capacity, and to me that's a term around the integration of the athlete and the wheelchair. So here we see Esther, a very highly trained wheelchair tennis player, and we see her back in Beijing looking quite lean and fit, physiologically maybe perhaps still fit in terms of physiologically here, but a little bit carrying a little bit of maybe percentage body fat here. However, they've changed their chair setup, and so now they're integrated as one, and again they're getting the marginal gains of performance by the performance system of effectively becoming an interface with the equipment. So we need to be thinking of testing in this environment because it is ecologically valid, but at the same time, if we're looking to try and look at our talented athletes, they won't have had this bespoke chair setup like I've alluded to earlier. So like I've mentioned, with those athletes, my take-home message is actually arm crank testing is perhaps better, because then you are looking at them independently of that equipment, and you then can actually look at their potential a lot better and have an established normative data using an arm crank ergometer for your talent profiling. And again, I can come back to that in the Q&A. So take-home message from that first part really is the fact that testing athletes, wheelchair athletes, does employ the same underpinning exercise testing protocols, but with subtle but yet significant alterations. We do need to have a thorough knowledge and do a needs analysis of the physical impairment before we undertake any testing, and indeed before we then prescribe any of the data in terms of training and the exercise implications. So moving on quickly, I just want to cover quickly 3 quick snapshots. I might be a little bit pushed for time, but let's see how it goes. Smart training. I'll start with smart training around the fact that I'm not going to be talking to you around the physiological consequences of the impairment types, but do read the books that tell you about the effects of spinal cord injury. But what I would like to just point 2 things on is the fact that you need to be thinking about 2 key aspects, and that is the level and the completeness of that injury, and that will help you with your interpretation of your data. What I mean by that is if we look at a heart rate response of someone who's spina bifida on the left and they're just doing a 10K performance race, we can see their heart rate will quickly go up, and during the race they've got a heart rate of 180 beats per minute. However, on the right, we have someone who's got a cervical C6, C8 spinal cord injury. At that start of the race, their heart rate goes up, but because of their blunted heart rate response, their maximal heart rate during the race is only 100 beats per minute for the full duration. Now, that is because of the autonomic disruption, and effectively they've not got the flight, fight and fight hormonal responses like we would have in terms of starting a race, and hence that blunted heart rate response is a consequence of that. And if we then have a look at the completeness of the injury, we also see here that someone is a C6 incomplete versus someone who's C6 complete, and we can see here that the very sort of, again, the sharp increase of a heart rate of 160 versus again someone who's only getting up to a heart rate of 100 beats per minute during an incremental test on the treadmill, leading to a VO2 peak test. So again, it's very important that you understand the impairment type and level and completeness for the interpretation of the data that you're looking at. Now, I'm a big believer around doing the simple things well. So really what I would be looking to do is trying to monitor training using rating of perceived exertion. For some population groups, if their heart rate is only reaching 100, 120 beats per minute, then they've got a very small margin for you to be prescribing training within. So we did actually undertake a study where basically on trial 1, we got someone to do a submaximal test through to a test to exhaustion. What we then did is we then imposed an exercise intensity of 70%. And we got the individual then to recall what their corresponding RPE was at that 70%. We collected blood lactate data, rating of perceived exertion, and the heart rate data as well. What we then found was when they came back for trial 3, they then reproduced the corresponding RPE, and then we gathered the data in terms of their VO2 and their heart rate. So we then said, well, if you reported an RPE of 16, now on that 3rd trial, just work at an RPE of 16. And what we actually found was there was very good reproducibility of the VO2 at the imposed exercise intensity as the one where we told them to regulate their exercise using the RPE. And what we concluded from that particular study using wheelchair rugby players is that in a highly trained population group, that the RPE was a very good training tool. So if they had to work at an RPE of 16, because we said that's about 70% from the laboratory testing, that RPE of 16 did translate very nicely to then the exercise that they want to be working at. So moving on to the wheelchair and a little bit of the biomechanics. So I've had one of my PhD students, Barry Mason, work looking at wheelchair mobility, and particularly one of the studies was looking at the rear wheel camber and the wheel size in athletes such as wheelchair tennis and wheelchair rugby and basketball players. And he's now a postdoc in the laboratory here. And what that work was doing was using a sort of a gyroscope attached to the inside of the wheelchair. It's now since moved to more fancy gadgets over the years, but ultimately what that does allow us to do is really look at the intra-push velocity profile during sprinting. So you can see here, this is the speed and this is the time we have on the axis here. So we can see push 1, push 2, push 3, push 4. And ideally in wheelchair sports, we're looking to try and limit the fact that you're braking the chair, i.e. slowing the chair down every time you put your hand in contact with the chair. We want it to be quite a fluent push, and we want it to be quite nice in terms of how the athlete is pushing the chair. And so hand speed and the chair itself is very important to be trying to optimize. So really, without going into too much detail, this is sharing some of the gadgets and the technologies that we have done and used. So like I've mentioned, we've used tracker systems. We're now collaborating with Dutch colleagues around other sort of sensor data, and we have published some work which we've used to try and actually measure the speed profiles in wheelchair court sports. And so hopefully if you do want to read some of this data, you can see again the technologies that indeed are merging in this area. So finally, the environment. Obviously, with Tokyo, with Rio, and some of the earlier games that we've had, I've been involved in travelling athletes to hot and challenging environments. And just very quickly, obviously, what we want to be doing is not only understand the demands of the sport, but integrate the heat aspect and cooling techniques into that environment too. So we have been working with McLaren Applied Technologies and UK Sport to try and look at this tracking system and add it onto the wheelchair during live games. So in wheelchair rugby, we've got a good understanding of what the sport looks like. So we basically interface the court indoors, and we use a 6-sensor satellite system, pretty much like GPS, to understand the demands of the sport itself. What we can do from that, like I say, the athlete would either wear it in this little sort of GPS vest, or indeed would mount it onto the chair, and athletes actually favoured it being mounted onto the chair, because obviously putting an extra garment on is only putting an extra layer on the individuals, which actually might be problematic with their lack of thermoregulation anyway. So we tag the chairs, and basically we then enable the squad, all differing in terms of their point categories. In wheelchair rugby, different impairment types, so les autres, CP, cerebral palsy, amputee, spinal cord, and we can begin then to understand the different styles of play and the different distances and demands that those point athletes are achieving. So our low spinal cord injured 0.5 players are covering just over 800 meters, but yet our amputees are covering 1,000 meters plus during each quarter. And we can get a breakdown in terms of the sprint, the peak speed, and try and understand more actually about the games relative to their position and their points classification, etc. And from that data, what we can do, we can look at maps of heat maps, we can look at technical features, we can look at work-rest ratios in terms of the sprint profiles. And again, I can guide you to some reading around some of this data here. But basically what we can then do is try and integrate that to the times and peaks of when their body core temperature is elevating. So we've done some nice work where we've combined ingestion of telemetry pill with the distances that players are covering on court. And we can see that when they're actually approaching the 40-degree body core temperature, that they've covered X amount of meters, they've done X amount of work. And we then can individualize the coaching strategy around timeouts, substitutions, and try and optimize and actually try and safeguard the individuals for not reaching these critical body core temperatures. And at the same time, we can begin to look at cooling strategies, trying to offset this rise in body temperature. So some work that I've done with Katie Griggs as part of her PhD, we had some tetraplegics at the top here and paraplegics at the bottom, and this is the body core temperature change. And we have bout 1 of exercise, recovery, bout 2, recovery, etc. And what we can see with our wheelchair basketball players, we've got quite good stabilization of the body core temperature. In the exercise, it elevates, it goes down in the rest, it goes up again and goes down. And they can sort of thermoregulate quite normally, like you and I could do if we were to play an indoor sport. Whereas the wheelchair rugby players, they are increasing their body core temperature, like shown on the previous slide, gradually, up to, in some cases, to a point where it is quite critical, according to some of the literature. Again, able-bodied guidance of pulling someone out of exercise at 39.5, 39.7 degrees centigrade. So obviously what we want to do here is administer something in terms of a cooling garment or a cooling strategy or pre-cool them to obviously make them healthy in terms of safeguarding and allowing them to perform in a healthy manner their sporting activity. So some of the interventions that we have looked at have been looking at practicalities, looking at the cooling power, and indeed looking to see if it can fit within the rules and regulations of the sport. Obviously, we can use some water sprays, the ice vests. We could cool the hands down, cool the feet, use ice slurries. But obviously, like I say, are they practical? What cooling power do they have? And we have done quite a vast amount of research in those areas. And again, I can share with you some of the research papers after the presentation if you'd like to read more around some of the work that we've done there. I was going to share a video, but actually on my recording that's not worked. So I'll just skip really just to the final bit now, where what I was going to show actually is just individual interventions where we have been able to sort of show that doing just a very small adaptation during the part-time sort of timeout of spraying the face with water, putting a fan beside them, indeed doing a warm-up whilst wearing an ice vest, having an individualized approach could be a nice way to offset the rise in body core temperature. So summary then, just to finalize today's presentation, then I do think that an understanding of the physical impairment is vital. Obviously, you need to do that in terms of screening the individuals for their functional movement pattern, look at their previous injury, illness, etc. before you think about the testing and the prescription of what you're looking to do. I feel that evidence-based research is essential, but we must not sort of forget the fact that anecdotal evidence and indeed the practitioner and the athlete's experience themselves is important and vital. And that sort of co-production of learning from the athlete and their environment, as well as what's come to date from the rehabilitation sciences, is essential to move this agenda forward. I feel that the knowledge and the application of sports science has improved in wheelchair sport over the many years, but that has happened because we've shared things. We've certainly worked as multidisciplinary fashion, and we've shared between rehabilitation specialists and sports scientists. And more importantly, actually, something I might not have really done in my first early days is we've shared from the Olympic practice to Paralympic practice and vice versa. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you for joining us. We're running a little bit late from the schedule, but that's okay. We have approximately half an hour for questions and answers. So we have one question in the chat box at the moment, and I encourage people to ask more questions because we have an amazing opportunity here to chat with Vicky online. So the question is, first of all, thank you for your very nice presentation. One of the biggest problems here is the lack of sporting equipment, for example, athletes, institutes, etc. How have you solved this problem in UK to recruit new athletes? Does health administration help sport administration in financing equipment? Thank you, Tony, for your question. Vicky.
Yes, thanks, Tony, for that. I guess in the UK, I mean, I think we have been quite fortunate with funding. So I think your question really, though, if we say new athletes, I'm not sure if you're referring to newly injured athletes, if we had spinal cord injury as an example. So I'll take both angles in the sense of we could have new athletes who have been inspired by watching the Paralympic Games and they want to get into sport, as well as those individuals who are coming through rehabilitation centres. So those people that come through the rehabilitation centres, we have actually got a very, very good network where they do taster sessions from the hospital into the community sport. And that's very well served through a network of what's called physical activity advisors. So our main sort of body is Wheelpower, that's based at Stoke Mandeville, and they'll get picked up there, and then they'll go and do wheelchair table tennis, might have a go at athletics, have a go at swimming, shooting, and they sort of go through the pathway into sport that way. And like I say, that's done more to charity level through spinal injury associations, Wheelpower, CP Sport, that's based in Nottingham, and they sort of encourage to do sport as a rehabilitation, and then they get into sport that way. However, if some individuals miss that opportunity, I had an athlete, for example, who had meningitis, so they found themselves in hospital that wasn't a spinal cord injury hospital, and indeed wasn't anything to do with amputee really. So their pathway into sport was they were inspired by watching the Paralympics. And then it was the sport itself that has what they describe as development pathways. So wheelchair rugby went and found people with different impairment types as part of talent recruitment and encouraged them to take part in sport. And then, like you say, is the limit there, though, is equipment. We work with a company that's called Motivation, and Motivation wheelchairs is actually adopted by the International Paralympic Committee as well. And they provide low-cost wheelchairs. I think it's, I don't know the exchange rate between British and Finnish pounds or money, but I think for £500 you can get quite a good wheelchair. And we are able to apply for equipment loans at an individual level, or indeed at a sport level. So various community sports hubs would apply for 10 wheelchairs, and then obviously they would do taster days. So hopefully that's sort of answering your question around how we do this, but we do have some really good networks.
Thank you for your answer for this question. Hopefully it clarified the matter. We have a couple of more questions now in the chat box. First off, Jonne Kamsola from the Finnish Society of Sports Sciences is thanking you for the excellent talk. And then a question, what recommendations do you have for future research in this area of fitness/performance testing and wheelchair athletes?
Yes, thanks for that. Obviously, sometimes we don't want to share too many secrets if it's going to lead to us winning medals, particularly if I'm usually speaking to the Canadians and they want to beat us at wheelchair rugby or wheelchair basketball. But I'm happy to share. I'm not saying that the Finns aren't good at wheelchair sports. Like you've got an excellent track record in winter activities, I guess, and we want to learn from you. But future research at the moment, actually, it's not research that I'm doing, but I've been reading about it recently, is I'm very intrigued around altitude and using hypoxia, because we've got an altitude hypoxia facility here at Loughborough University now. And for rehabilitation, I've been reading just recently the use of hypoxia for gaining functional capacity in injured athletes, as in able-bodied Olympic injured athletes. And I'm sort of wondering at this moment in time whether or not there could be any transferability of what could be gained during passive stroke, I guess an intermittent protocol of some description, whilst obviously in a hypoxia environment, and what the effects that might have on an individual who's an amputee or spinal cord injured, and whether or not that can be transferable. So that's sort of an area that we are beginning to explore at the moment at time. The other area at the moment, actually, and I won't perhaps say too many more, I'll leave it on this one to move to other questions, but the other area actually at the moment is, unfortunately, in particularly if I use the focus wheelchair sport, the athletes tend to focus 90% of their time, efforts, money, finance, research on the performing chair. So if I use wheelchair racing as the example, then it's a really high-tech chair. They put all their effort in trying to optimize that performance chair. Whereas if you actually think about their lifestyle actually involves pushing a daily wheelchair as well as that high-tech sports chair. And a lot of the injuries, stroke, aches and pains come from a poorly fitted everyday chair. So we're actually moving now to look at the holistic environments. That might involve sleep, quality of life, pain management, etc. But we're looking more at the health and well-being of the athlete as being the center. And like I say, that actually incorporates daily activities, day chair, their lifestyle, as well as high performance. I think we need to understand that as well, because a lot of athletes, like I say, just concentrate on performance rather than the bigger picture in their life.
Thank you so much. I like your answer and the point of having a more holistic view on the everyday life and how the everyday chair can affect the performance as well. I think it's very, very interesting and something to explore. The next question is from Simon Walker. The mean RPE for the group matched well to the target, but there is some variation in the accuracy between athletes. How do you address this, and how much practice does it take to be accurate in self-regulating intensity?
Yes, apologies for my presentation getting quicker towards the end. I can talk for hours around the area, and I think I was a bit ambitious with putting so much in the presentation, so apologies with that. So therefore I didn't perhaps concentrate too much on describing the RPE aspect. The very brief study that I shared with you actually was in highly trained, if I get it right, what I did share, I've done two sort of main studies where we've used RPE. One actually is with the population of wheelchair rugby players, and one actually is with hand cyclists. And both those two papers are published. And actually what I stress in the publication, where we've done basically two trials, we've done that sort of regulated trial to determine what their RPE is, and then the self-regulated to determine whether it matches that controlled trial. And in well-trained individuals who are familiar, and I think that's the word I'm repeating, that are familiar in using RPE, then basically it is regulated very well and can be reproduced. So if I was to have someone in the laboratory, we run a particular test, and I sort of say, well, actually go and do a moderate training at that particular RPE, 12, 14, 16, whatever I want to try and prescribe for them, I am actually very confident that that will be reproduced. However, we have undergone some experiments here at Loughborough where we've used able-bodied participants in a wheelchair to look at the learning profile based on fitness and familiarisation of RPE. It's quite a nice model using able-bodied individuals in wheeled mobility or hand cycling mobility, because it's an unfamiliar activity for them. So you are then replicating a newly injured individual or someone who's getting into sport who, again, might have a physical impairment. And I would say that it does come with practice. We found maybe after about 4 or 5 prescribed controlled RPE sessions, the individual would match their RPE quite nicely. And we have retrospectively gone through some data just recently during a longitudinal training study of persons with spinal cord injury to look at the stability of RPE. And we did find that it did stabilize once it's anchored to feeling. I didn't actually get onto it in the presentation, but again, if you're familiar, and I'm not without knowing people's background in the room, but RPE can be described and broken down to differentiated RPE. And I didn't again explain our research in that area. I can come back and do that next year. But basically we do work with overall RPE, but if I was to prescribe it to individuals newly acquired an injury and getting into wheelchair sport, I would actually describe to them to focus on their peripheral RPE, their musculature RPE, rather than the heart and the central RPE aspect. And I'll try and differentiate it with them, because we know that peripheral factors limit exercise in upper body exercise. So again, we've got to be very careful with how we do use RPE, but I guess I'm sort of agreeing in the sense that we do need to do it in someone who understands it and has practiced it.
Thank you for your answer. More questions coming up, and we still have time for more if the participants want to ask. But next one is from Kimmo Mustonen from the Finnish Olympic Committee. He's asking, thanks for an excellent presentation first off, and regarding the spinal cord injured athletes, what are the lessons learned from Rio 2016 and towards Tokyo 2021?
Yes, I guess I have reflected on the lessons learned from Rio, and some of those lessons really, I'm just trying to think of an example, but I think one of those examples is when I worked with para-triathlon. So Rio was the first event for that particular sport, and again, heat, humidity in Rio was something that we're now preparing, obviously, for Tokyo 2021. I need to get used to saying that, 2021, but obviously next year. And obviously we go through preparation by the environment, by the place that we're going to, and there's going to be a lot of synergies with Rio to Tokyo. And what I think we learnt with para-triathlon, and actually it's become a rule change by the International Triathlon Union anyway, and I've been party to this from some of my research. It's quite a nice finding to think that the research that myself and one of my PhD students, Ben Stevenson, done has actually informed changes at an international level by the actual sporting body. And what I mean by that is that a lot of individuals in para-triathlon, for those that might work in that particular sport, they wear obviously wetsuits. Because if you're spinal cord injured, you wear a wetsuit for buoyancy, as well as obviously for the fact that the water might be cold. But in Rio, again, it was a sea swim, but our data that we've been collecting in preparation for Tokyo has been all the test events leading into qualification. And when athletes have been out in Italy, when it's been quite warm, they obviously by rules and regulations are allowed to wear a half suit wetsuit. But what we found in a couple of our cerebral palsy athletes who need some assistance, and spinal cord injury, who need assistance with taking the wetsuit on and off in transition, we've actually found that they were wearing the wetsuit too early. And so they were actually overheating quite a bit before they actually started the event. So again, through lessons of Rio and looking at the test events leading into Tokyo qualification, we're always working at an individual level to try and see what works best for others. And the main challenges and lessons that we've learned have really been around the heat side of things in Rio leading through to Tokyo, because mainly as a British athlete, then jet lag and travel fatigue wasn't too much of a problem going into Rio because there was only a 4-hour time difference. Whereas going into Tokyo, there's other factors to be considering, which might be then going back a few other cycles of saying, well, when we went to Beijing, we had a jet lag strategy. So we use different pieces of different cycles where it's relevant.
Thank you. I'm sure that those lessons learned are valuable information for us here in Finland as well. And the jet lag is obviously an important factor to take in consideration, and the climate and humidity. We have more questions here. Jonne Kamsola is asking, how much normal daily activities affect the recovery of spinal cord injured athletes, para, tetra, vs, AB athletes? Your opinions, how to manage that? And I'm not quite sure what does Jonne mean with the AB, but maybe you have knowledge about that.
Yeah, AB being, I guess, able-bodied
right.
athletes. So I guess you're comparing across the para, non-SCI, SCI, and able-bodied. And I think that's, I mean, it's a very intriguing question what you have there, because I feel that at an Olympic able-bodied perspective is we know what our normal activity is and we can measure that. I mean, I've already got my Apple Watch on this morning to hopefully later on today. Actually, I'm going off to Korea, actually, today's presentation from Finland. So I'm being world traveled virtually today. And so I want to go and do some steps. And obviously I can put my watch on and I can measure my steps to try and understand, not that I'm an Olympic runner, but I could balance my day accordingly of thinking I've done that amount of activity in the daytime, I'm now doing my sports training. So what you're questioning there actually is very important, but something that is not very well understood, because the measurement tools to measure daily activity of your para and tetra athletes is often used using gadgets that have been designed for an Olympic able-bodied individual. Yes, there is a button now on the iWatch that allows you to say that you're pushing a wheelchair. So therefore it can look at pushes as well as step count. But then if you're going downhill or you're just sort of like swinging your arms around, it's doing something, but that's not pushing, that's not the external load. So we have been working with various sort of tech companies to try and establish, well, can we actually really measure the additional external load of a wheelchair participant and try and put that into a 24-hour day to be adding these things up? Because ultimately what you're saying there is the normal daily activity perhaps is very important more for energy balance, and our nutritionists and dietitians are using that type of information to then be looking at calorific intake, because obesity and perhaps using less calories per day is a main factor and feature in some of our Paralympic athletes if their sport isn't as demanding as the track athletes, for example. So we have our table tennis players, our fencers, our power lifters and shooters, and they might be trying to get an energy balance in their daily activity, which then needs to be matched with their food intake accordingly. So we do try and gather this information, but I would say it's not very well understood. And using the able-bodied normative data to say that I've done some ironing, I want to see what the calorific energy expenditure of that is, doesn't work in our para or our tetra athletes. It will under or overestimate the work that's done. So actually going back to the research question, that's a gap in the literature.
Yes, thank you. That was a very, very interesting question from Jonne and a very interesting answer for sure. We still have a couple more questions, and I think we have time for 2 questions here, or there's a third one now. Let's see what we can do. So the next one, how do you see the evidence-based classification will change the system of parasport class categories? Do you think, for example, razor sheet point system used in athletics will be used more commonly in future?
Yes, apologies actually that I'm not too familiar with some of the athletics. I'm not sure about what the Razor sheet is. I am aware of the changes that have taken place recently with the IPC and the minimum sort of eligibility sort of criteria that's being introduced just recently, particularly mainly in wheelchair tennis, wheelchair basketball, because of some of the work that's coming out via the media. I have to put my hand up to say I'm not that familiar with the athletics side of things, but I think, I mean, I guess at the end of the day is it's all around fairness in competition. So I can see in principle why certain aspects are being changed in the IPC classification code at this moment in time. And there's still some sports where you sort of think, well, someone who's missing a foot through amputation, who's then competing against someone who has got no trunk, which actually is the case in wheelchair tennis and their open classification, that there might be an unfairness in certain things, and sometimes people with a more severe impairment are getting missed out of the sort of sporting environment because coaches are putting in people with more trunk, and they're favouring those individuals. So there's a fine line in classification really in sport around whether you're looking at competitive sport and high performance or whether you're looking for inclusive sport. I'm hopeful that classification means that it's changed for the better, but we're all a little bit resistant to change. And I think it'll just take time for some of these new classification systems to embed within the various sports. So I think I'll leave it there because you might be more familiar with what's happening in the sport of athletics.
Thank you. We'll go on fast with the questions. We have few coming up. Kimmo Mustonen from the Finnish Olympic Committee is asking, do you have same kind of testing recommendations as spinal cord injured athletes for other disability groups?
Thank you for that. We're just actually at this moment in time trying to collate a new book chapter for our British Association of Sport and Exercise Sciences. So that's BASES. BASES is my sort of association that I work towards, and they're actually asking me, I guess, a similar question, that if someone was to arrive in someone's laboratory down the road in Coventry and up the road in Liverpool, is if they've got a treadmill or wheelchair ergometer, then how do they test that athlete? And unfortunately, sometimes I sort of say, well, actually, it's perhaps in my head, it's down to my experience. I sort of know by chatting to them, doing a bit of an assessment around their functional capacity. I know how to start a test and what type of increments to make. Obviously, I highlighted a research paper in the presentation, Hartung, quite an old one, that's combining the sort of gradient and speed protocol. But I think there is enough evidence out there. It's just trying to collate it, and actually that's what I'm now doing to try and give some more normative data around testing. I think a key factor is maybe to say, well, does your athlete have a coordination impairment? Because if they do and they're perhaps cerebral palsy, then a speed increment test may not be suited. Certainly at the latter test, you might want to do a combined gradient and speed protocol and then increase the speed or the gradient of the treadmill or resistance on some rollers towards the latter part of the test to bring them to, for example, a VO2 peak, because their hand speed and coordination might limit them with doing that final sort of 2 or 3 minutes on a wheelchair test. So to be truthful, it's quite exploratory in my mind, but I do think that there are some tests out there that are quite, what I mean by that, protocols out there that are quite standard. And to be truthful, if you're starting with quite new athletes, then I think what I said in my presentation is I would pretty much stick to maybe an arm crank test, which takes out the skill component and can be done quite nicely for talent identification. And then once that individual's been recognised for talent in the para world, you obviously then interface them with the sports equipment, i.e. the wheelchair, the sporting wheelchair, and then that becomes more ecologically valid. But it does come with practice as you as an investigator. But at the same time, as the athlete gets more attuned to the actual testing environment, then I think they do become quite standardized tests over time.
Thank you so much. A couple more questions, continuing with the questions about the spinal cord injured athletes. What to take into account when tailoring testing protocols developed for CSI wheelchair racers to wheelchair racers with disabilities with symptoms similar to cerebral palsy?
Yeah, I think that touches on what I was getting to at the end of that last question, really, is like I mentioned, is someone with cerebral palsy, you sort of putting them into that coordination aspect, and ultimately you perhaps don't want to elicit fatigue too quickly, because depending if they have a good day or bad day in terms of how they described it to me, then sometimes they come into the laboratory and they can really excel on a test, and another day they get fatigued quite quickly, and they do fatigue in heat as well. So obviously I do need to make sure that the laboratory is sort of neutral in terms of its temperature, and there may be some advantage to maybe do a discontinuous test for someone who's got cerebral palsy. I'm saying maybe because I think I, for example, work with the wheelchair rugby team, and I sort of know the test and I reproduce the test at an individual level in terms of the increments, the start speed, etc. And like I say, it's quite hard sometimes to start that, but I've got this sort of database of sort of knowing that an athlete compares to another athlete, etc. So it is very anecdotal, really. But I would say that I would have no hesitation with doing a bit more of a discontinuous test. So you might do sort of a 2-minute stage of power output on an arm crank or on a wheelchair, and then maybe put a 30 seconds recovery, and then do another 2 minutes, 30 second, or that 2 minutes might be too long. You might do 1 minute, little break, 1 minute, etc. So someone with cerebral palsy, in the first instance, I would be tempted to do a bit of a discontinuous test just to give them a bit of a break. But at the same time, you don't want the test to be going too long. So like I say, it's sort of a bit of a compromise there. But again, as they get more familiar with the environment and more familiar with the actual testing procedures, then I think it will just come with practice.
Thank you. Another very interesting question and a very interesting answer to it. We have one final question here from Laura Kittelä from Pajulahti Finnish Olympic Training Center. Thank you for your presentation, Vicky. Hypoxia and parasports is something what is an interesting question in our center also, as we're building a network around this topic in Finland. It would be interesting to hear about some examples. How do you share expertise in Great Britain around this topic?
Yes, thank you, Laura. Again, that's an interesting one. I work with the English Institute of Sport. So I'm an academic at Loughborough University. And so if I was looking to share my academic sort of research, then I do that via, I guess, the English Institute of Sport, because that's a hub in England, in Great Britain. We have sort of Scotland and Wales doing sort of similar aspects. And effectively, I would then be invited to a presentation, or we run workshops, etc. And the key aspect there is that becomes an educational hub, and we share best practice between the practitioners. And obviously, like I say, academics come to those as well. As the English Institute of Sport is funded by UK Sport and it's dependent on medals, this is where the top secrets exist a little bit. And we do actually have a closed workspace where the practitioners have got password protected educational material. So even me as an academic sometimes can't go into that workspace because it's all the practitioners working with the sports, sharing those knowledge. But because I am a consultant and a practitioner with wheelchair rugby, wheelchair tennis, and para triathlon, obviously I share the expertise with the practitioners there. So sometimes, I guess, at an elite sport level, these experiences perhaps aren't shared. But when we get the sign off and approval from the sports, they're happy for us to share it with the academic community. So everything that I've shared today in the presentation has been published. And we have an agreement with the sports that they read our academic papers and they can sign to say they're happy for them to be sent out for peer review to be in the academic community, where some of our work, for example, sharing some of the top secrets for Tokyo 2021, we haven't published that work yet. However, we know that everyone's doing it. We know that, you know, you might be doing hypoxia, we might be doing hypoxia, and eventually it will get shared. But at the moment, obviously, we haven't shared this information. Like I mentioned, hypoxia is new to us, so I'm happy to hear from you. But obviously, we haven't really got anything live at this moment in time. We've got potentially one player who is going to try hypoxia in the next few months, but I haven't received any data yet of what that looks like. I'm sharing my hypoxia experience with Knotville. So if you're familiar with the spinal cord injury sort of research centre there, then Claudio Perriot, who's a leading researcher around sort of wheelchair endurance sports, then he has done a study on hypoxia actually, so it'd be worth you connecting with him.
Thank you. And building a better network with experts around parasports here in Finland is probably a good idea, and that's why we're all here today, to promote para-athlete testing in Finland and building better networks. So that's good to hear that you have this network and it's working efficiently. At this point, I think we're running out of time, and we have had a lot of questions, and thank you for all the questions, and especially thank you, Vicky, for this very good answers and interesting lecture. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope that we can be in touch in the future and collaborate more. And good luck with the preparation of Tokyo 2021. We'll see you there, and be aware, we're coming at you.
Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your presentations that you have today.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.